An elderly black woman is harassed by the police late at night, but they have no idea her son is the state attorney general. When she becomes the target of a corrupt system, he faces an impossible choice: stay silent to keep her safe or expose the truth and ignite a war he may not win. But in a game rigged from the start, does justice even stand a chance? The evening air was crisp as Evelyn Carter stepped out of the grocery store, balancing a paper bag filled with fresh produce in her arms. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching over the near-empty parking lot. It was a quiet night in Minneapolis, the kind where the distant hum of the freeway and the occasional flicker of neon signs were the only signs of life. She placed the bag on the passenger seat of her old blue sedan, the same one her late husband had bought nearly 2 decades ago. The engine hummed softly as she turned the key, a comforting sound that had carried her through many years of independence. But just as she adjusted her rearview mirror, she noticed something. A police cruiser parked a short distance away. The officer inside was staring in her direction. Evelyn wasn't a stranger to this kind of attention. Growing up in the South, she had learned early on that a black woman behind the wheel could sometimes attract the wrong kind of scrutiny. But here, in a city she had called home for over 40 years, she had hoped things were different. She exhaled slowly, brushing off the unease creeping up her spine. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just watching the lot, looking for something, or someone else. She pulled out carefully, merging onto the main road, her headlights illuminating the empty stretch ahead. The cruiser followed, her grip tightened around the steering wheel. It could still be a coincidence. Minneapolis had plenty of officers patrolling at this hour. Maybe he was heading in the same direction. But at every turn she took, he did the same. She adjusted her rearview mirror again. The police car maintained a steady distance, its presence looming like a shadow she couldn't shake. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened, a familiar rhythm of dread setting in. She had read too many headlines, watched too many news reports. She thought of Sandra Bland. She thought of Philando Castile, who had been shot by an officer just outside the Twin Cities only a few years ago. No, don't let your mind go there. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. She was a retired schoolteacher, a 70-year-old woman on her way home from the store. There was no reason for fear. Still, as she approached her neighborhood, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. The houses were dark, most of her neighbors already settled in for the night. Just a few more turns, and she'd be home, safe. Then, suddenly, a flash of red and blue filled her rearview mirror. The siren wailed, sharp and jarring in the stillness of the night. Evelyn's stomach lurched as the voice crackled over the speaker. Pull over, now. Her fingers curled around the steering wheel, her knuckles turning pale. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a light. There was no reason for this. Yet here she was, alone on a quiet street, with a police cruiser demanding she stop. Evelyn swallowed hard, her pulse thudding against her ribs. She signaled, pulling her car to the curb as the weight of the moment pressed against her chest. Evelyn Carter pulled her car over to the side of the empty street, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than she realized. The air inside the vehicle felt heavy, thick with the weight of uncertainty. She took a slow breath, reminding herself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time she had been stopped, but something about this felt different. Through her side mirror, she saw the officer step out of his cruiser. He moved with deliberate slowness, as if he enjoyed dragging out the moment. The glow of the streetlights cast sharp shadows over his features. But even without seeing his face clearly, she could sense the authority he carried, not just in his uniform, but in his stance, the way he approached her car like it already belonged to him. The beam of his flashlight cut through the night, blinding her momentarily as he shined it directly into the driver's side window. The knock on the glass was firm, not a polite tap but a demand. License and registration. His voice was flat, clipped, as if he had repeated these words 100 times that night and had no patience left for another encounter. Evelyn squinted up at him, blinking against the brightness. Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped? Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, one she hoped he wouldn't hear. The officer, now fully visible, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp, cold eyes. His badge gleamed under the streetlight, "Step out of the vehicle," he said. She hesitated. Her fingers twitched against the worn leather of the steering wheel. She knew her rights. Knew that she was under no obligation to leave her car unless he had cause. But she also knew that arguing could turn a routine stop into something far worse. The officer, Mark Reynolds, didn't wait for her to decide. He rapped his knuckles against the window. "Harder this time," I said. "Step out of the car." Evelyn swallowed, unbuckled her seatbelt, and pushed the door open. As she stood, the cool night air brushed against her skin, but it did little to calm the heat rising in her chest. Reynolds stepped in closer, invading her space, his flashlight now lowered but still in his grip. "Where are you coming from?" She met his gaze, forcing herself not to look away. "I went to the grocery store." He tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning the car, then the street behind them. "A car like this, out here at this hour?" He let the words hang between them, heavy with implication. Her jaw tightened. "Is there a problem with my car, officer?" A slow smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth, as if he found her question amusing. "That depends," he murmured. Evelyn clenched her hands at her sides, feeling her patience stretch thinner with every second. She wanted to ask him outright what he was looking for, what possible reason he had to prolong this stop. But she knew better. Across the street, a porch light flickered on. A figure stood just beyond the glow, an older white man in a robe. Watching from a distance, Evelyn's eyes flicked toward him for only a second. But Reynolds noticed. He let out a slow breath. Then, as if deciding he had wasted enough time, took a step back. "Go home," he said, his tone suddenly lighter. "Consider this a warning." She hesitated. "Just like that?" But before she could process it, he leaned down, resting an arm against the open window of her car. His voice dropped just enough that only she could hear. "Next time," he said, "you might not be so lucky." A chill ran through her spine. Reynolds straightened, tapping the roof of her car as if dismissing her. Evelyn didn't move right away. Her hands trembled as she gripped the door handle, steadying herself before sliding back into the driver's seat. As she pulled away, her breath came in slow, measured waves, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. In the mirror, she saw him standing there, watching her go. Evelyn woke to the faint glow of morning light seeping through the curtains. But her mind was still trapped in the events of the previous night. The unease hadn't faded, lingering like a weight in her chest. She moved through her morning routine with deliberate care, making tea, sitting by the kitchen window, watching the world outside. It was an old habit, one that usually brought her a sense of peace. But today, her eyes kept flicking toward the street. She told herself it was just nerves, that she was being paranoid. Then she saw it, a police cruiser, parked across from her house. It wasn't moving, wasn't making its presence obvious. But the longer she watched, the more she knew it was watching her. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her mug. A coincidence, she might have thought yesterday. Not anymore. She gathered her things, determined not to let fear dictate her day. The car was still there as she stepped outside, the morning air crisp against her skin. She refused to look directly at it, but she could feel the gaze of whoever sat inside. She climbed into her sedan, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. The cruiser didn't follow immediately. It waited, as if giving her space to doubt herself. Then it rolled into motion. She checked the rearview mirror, her pulse quickening. Every turn she took, it mirrored. She wasn't imagining this. By the time she reached the main road, her breath was coming slower, steadier. She wouldn't let them rattle her. Not again. But then the red and blue lights flashed. She exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel as she pulled over to the side of the road. A door slammed. Footsteps crunched against the pavement. When Evelyn turned her head, it wasn't just Reynolds approaching this time. Another officer walked beside him. Younger, broader, his presence adding weight to the situation. "Broke the law again, ma'am," Reynolds said, his grin sharp and smug. "Didn't use your turn signal." Evelyn held his gaze, refusing to let him see even a flicker of doubt. "That's not true. Are you calling me a liar?" His tone was still light, but there was something coiled beneath it, waiting. Evelyn's lips pressed together. She forced herself to keep her voice calm. "I'm saying I know I signaled." Reynolds let the silence stretch. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, He rested a hand on his belt. Step out of the car. This time, the order came with no room for argument. Evelyn hesitated. She could refuse, could demand a legitimate reason. But she knew how that would end. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the pavement. The second officer, Hughes, his name tag read, moved in closer behind her. Too close. Her breath grew shallow. This wasn't routine. This was a message. And then, from the sidewalk, another voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem, officers? Evelyn turned her head. James Parker stood a few feet away. Phone raised. Recording. His face was set. Serious. Reynolds' expression flickered, annoyance flashing across his features. He looked at Hughes, then back at Parker. Then, just like that, the tension drained from his stance. No problem at all, Reynolds said. He took a step back, flashing that same smirk as the night before. Just making sure the good citizens of this town follow the rules. Evelyn didn't move until he did. Didn't breathe fully until both officers were back in their cruiser. As they pulled away, she didn't miss the way Reynolds glanced at her in the mirror. This wasn't over. Evelyn sat in her car outside her home, her hands still resting on the steering wheel. The weight of the last 24 hours pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She had tried to shake it off, to tell herself she had done nothing wrong. But the truth gnawed at her. This wasn't going away. She reached for her phone, hesitated for a moment, then dialed her son's number. It rang twice before his voice came through, steady but distracted. Hey, Mama, Daniel said. Everything okay? She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound of his voice ground her. No, baby, it's not. There was a pause, the faint rustling of papers in the background. What happened? Evelyn inhaled, then recounted everything. The stops, the way Reynolds had looked at her, the presence of the second officer. She kept her voice even, leaving nothing out, though the anger simmering underneath threatened to spill over. By the time she finished, Daniel was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, controlled. They're testing you. Evelyn already knew that. She didn't need him to confirm it. I will consider this, he continued. But listen to me. Be careful. If they're trying to intimidate you, it means they want a reaction. We need to be smart about this. She gripped the phone tighter. What do we do? Daniel exhaled. First, we gather proof. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. All right, but as she ended the call, an unease settled in her chest. She had no doubt that Daniel would fight for her. But what if this fight was bigger than they realized? She wasn't just afraid of what these officers might do. She was afraid of what her son might be walking into. The next afternoon, Evelyn found herself in a sleek downtown office, seated across from a woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. Maya Roberts, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state, listened intently as Evelyn and Daniel laid out everything. She didn't interrupt, only nodding as she scribbled notes in a leather-bound notebook. When Evelyn finished, Maya leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk. This isn't just harassment, this is targeted. Daniel crossed his arms. We need to find out why. Maya flipped through a file on her desk, pulling out a sheet of paper. Reynolds has a history, she said. Multiple complaints, excessive force, unlawful stops, intimidation tactics. But every single case against him disappeared before it could go anywhere. Evelyn's stomach tightened. How? Maya's expression darkened. Someone higher up has been protecting him. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his chin. Then we start with the basics. We need to get someone on record. Maya nodded. James Parker, your neighbor. Would he be willing to testify? Evelyn frowned. I don't know. He stepped in last time. But standing up in court? She wasn't sure. Maya leaned forward. It's a risk, but without witnesses. It's just your word against theirs. Daniel's jaw clenched. Then we get more than just words. Maya reached into her desk and pulled out a small device, setting it in front of Evelyn. A dashboard camera. It records everything while you're driving. If they stop you again, we'll have video. Evelyn hesitated, staring at the device. The idea of needing something like this just to feel safe left a bitter taste in her mouth. But she took it anyway. Later that evening, Evelyn stepped onto her porch, the weight of the day settling deep in her bones. The street was quiet, The kind of stillness that usually brought her comfort. She reached for her keys. But something on the ground caught her eye. A small white envelope, tucked just beneath the door. She bent down, her fingers stiff as she picked it up. The paper was smooth, unmarked. She opened it slowly. Inside, a single sentence was typed on plain paper. "Don't get involved if you want to stay safe." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She turned her head, scanning the street, the shadows beneath the streetlights. Nothing, no movement. But someone had been here. Daniel sat at his desk. The glow of his office lamp casting long shadows across the stacks of case files spread before him. His mother's voice still echoed in his mind, the fear beneath her steady tone sticking with him like a thorn. He had dealt with officers like Reynolds before, men who wore their badges like armor, using them not to protect, but to control. Yet something about this felt different, more deliberate, more dangerous. He pulled up the internal database on his laptop and typed in the name, Mark Reynolds. A few seconds later, the screen filled with reports. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he scrolled through them. 3 formal complaints, excessive force, intimidation, unlawful stops, yet no disciplinary action, no suspensions, no terminations. It was as if each case had simply vanished. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. That didn't happen by accident. Someone had erased those records before they could go anywhere. Someone high up. If Reynolds was untouchable, it meant one thing: he wasn't acting alone. Later that evening, Daniel parked outside a small diner on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign flickered overhead as he stepped inside, the scent of coffee and grilled meat thick in the air. In a corner booth sat a man in a worn leather jacket, sipping from a chipped white mug. Roger Dalton looked up as Daniel approached. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking," Dalton muttered, setting his mug down. Daniel slid into the booth across from him. "You know why I'm here." Dalton studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, and I'm telling you right now, you're stepping into something bigger than you realize." Daniel folded his hands together. "Tell me," Dalton sighed, glancing around the diner before lowering his voice. "Reynolds isn't just some rogue cop. He's protected. There's a group inside the department, higher-ups who cover for guys like him. They make things disappear. Reports, complaints, witness statements, anything that could put a target on their backs." Daniel's jaw tightened. "How many of them?" Dalton hesitated. "Enough." Daniel leaned forward. "And Briggs? He's in on it too?" Dalton nodded grimly. "Briggs, a couple of captains, maybe even someone in the commissioner's office. It's not just about dirty cops roughing people up. It's bigger than that." Daniel's stomach turned. "How deep does this go?" Dalton let out a slow breath. "Deep enough that if you keep pushing, you'd better be ready for what's coming." As Daniel walked back to his car, the night air felt heavier than before. He unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and sat in silence for a moment, his thoughts racing. Then, in his rearview mirror, movement caught his eye. A dark-colored sedan sat at the end of the block. The headlights weren't on, but the outline of a figure inside was just visible through the windshield. Daniel's pulse quickened. He started the engine but didn't pull out right away. Instead, he watched, waited. After a few seconds, the car in the distance inched forward. Daniel exhaled slowly. They weren't just trying to intimidate his mother anymore. Now, they were watching him too. Evelyn sat stiffly in the worn leather chair of the police station's waiting area, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a cold glow over the room. Officers walked past without looking at her, but she could feel their glances, quick, measuring. She wasn't here by accident, and she knew it. A few minutes later, the door to the back offices swung open. Mark Reynolds stepped through first, followed closely by a taller, older man with graying hair and a sharp gaze. Captain Samuel Briggs. Evelyn straightened her spine as they approached, forcing herself to meet their eyes. Briggs was the one who spoke first. "Mrs. Carter, you've been cited for multiple traffic violations over the past few days. Reckless driving, failure to obey traffic signals, operating a vehicle in an unsafe manner." He delivered the words with a practiced neutrality, as if reading off a grocery list. "Given your record, we're going to have to hold onto your license for a while." Evelyn's jaw tightened. That's a lie. Briggs didn't react, but Reynolds let out a small chuckle. I don't know what to tell you. Briggs continued. The evidence is pretty clear. He nodded to Reynolds, who reached into a folder and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen, turning it toward her. A grainy video played, her car weaving slightly, a red light flashing as she rolled through an intersection. Evelyn's stomach clenched. She knew that wasn't real. She had been careful. She lifted her eyes to Reynolds, who smiled. Lucky we had dash cams rolling, he said. This town's got enough reckless drivers. Can't be too careful. Evelyn stayed silent, refusing to take the bait. Briggs leaned in slightly. You understand, of course, that this is standard procedure. We're just making sure the streets stay safe. Evelyn knew exactly what this was. A warning. A message to let her know they weren't finished with her. She took a slow breath. I'd like to call my attorney. Reynolds' smile didn't fade. Of course. Daniel arrived at the station 20 minutes later, moving quickly but controlled, his expression unreadable. Maya Roberts walked beside him, her heels clicking against the tile floor with purpose. They didn't bother sitting down. We're going to need to see that footage, Maya said the moment they reached the front desk. All of it, and the timestamps. The desk sergeant hesitated, then looked toward Briggs, who had stepped out of his office at the sound of their arrival. The captain gave a slow nod. Reynolds sauntered out a moment later, looking amused. Well, didn't take you long, Carter. Daniel ignored him. Where's my mother? Briggs gestured toward a side room. She's fine. Just a little paperwork. Maya folded her arms. And these charges? Briggs gave a small shrug. Traffic violations are one thing. But we've had a separate complaint come in. It seems Mrs. Carter was causing a public disturbance. Something about making a scene. Refusing to cooperate with officers. Daniel's blood ran cold. That's not true. Briggs didn't even blink. The reports say otherwise. Reynolds leaned against the desk. And the thing about reports, Carter, they tend to stick. Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. For the first time, he understood exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was an escalation. Briggs watched him closely, as if waiting to see his next move. Daniel exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. He wouldn't let them win that easily. We'll be filing a formal complaint, Maya said, her voice steady. Briggs nodded, unconcerned. Do what you have to do. As Daniel turned to walk away, Reynolds called after him, his tone laced with mock sympathy. You might be the Attorney General, Carter, but that doesn't mean you can't fall. Daniel didn't look back, but his jaw was set, his mind already working. They wanted a fight. They were going to get one. Daniel sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the paused video playing on his laptop. The footage showed his mother's car moving through an intersection, the red traffic light glowing above. The problem was, he knew for a fact that she had never run that light. He pressed play again, this time watching the timestamp. Something was off. The numbers flickered slightly, as if they had been altered. He rewound, frame by frame, until he saw it. A cut in the footage, so seamless that an untrained eye wouldn't have noticed. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. Within minutes, a voice answered. You sure about this, Carter? The man on the other end was Lucas Barnes, a digital forensic expert Daniel had worked with in the past. Because if what you're saying is true, someone went through a lot of trouble to make this look real. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. I need proof, Lucas. I need to know exactly how they did it. A long pause. Then, send me the file. I'll get back to you soon. 2 hours later, Lucas called back. They doctored the footage. He confirmed. The timestamp's been manipulated, and the car's movements were altered. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Daniel exhaled, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just a scare tactic. This was a setup. Maya Roberts arrived at his office not long after, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the forensic report. We have enough to file a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, she said. Tampering with evidence is a federal offense. This could bring the entire department under scrutiny. Daniel nodded. File it. But he knew the wheels of justice turned slowly. They needed more than just legal action. They needed public pressure. That night, Daniel met with Lisa Hernandez, A seasoned investigative journalist whose reputation for exposing corruption made her both respected and feared. "You're telling me the police fabricated evidence against your mother?" Lisa leaned forward, her pen tapping lightly against her notepad. "That's a hell of a claim. Carter, I wouldn't come to you if I wasn't sure." Lisa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we do this. We do it right. I'll need the files, the analysis, everything." Daniel slid a flash drive across the table. "You'll have it." Lisa pocketed it. "I'll start digging, but you should know, if we go public with this, they're going to push back, hard." Daniel met her gaze. "Let them." Back at home, Evelyn sat in the living room, the television murmuring in the background. She had tried to keep herself busy, but her thoughts kept circling back to Daniel. He was fighting this battle, not just for her, but for something much bigger, and she couldn't shake the fear that he was walking straight into danger. Hours later, Daniel left Lisa's office, stepping out into the cool night air. The city hummed quietly around him, streetlights casting long shadows along the pavement. Then, out of nowhere, headlights flared. A black SUV barreled toward him. Daniel barely had time to react before he threw himself to the side, landing hard against the curb as the vehicle sped past. The SUV screeched around the corner and disappeared into the night. His pulse pounded in his ears. His hands pressed against the cold pavement as he pushed himself up, breath coming in short bursts. That wasn't a mistake. That was a message. As he stood, something caught his eye. A small slip of paper fluttered on the ground, just inches from where he had fallen. He bent down, picking it up. Only one sentence was printed on it. "Back off before it's too late." Daniel stared at the words, his jaw tightening. They had just made their biggest mistake. Maya Roberts was finishing her morning coffee when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the caller ID, an unknown number. She hesitated for a second before answering. "Ms. Roberts?" The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Jonathan Reed from the State Bar Association. We need to discuss a complaint that's been filed against you." Maya's brow furrowed. "What kind of complaint?" There was a brief pause before the man continued. "Allegations of professional misconduct. We've received reports that you may have engaged in unethical legal practices. We'll be opening an investigation immediately." Maya's grip on the phone tightened. "That's absurd. Who filed this?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that at this time," Reed said, "but you should know this is a serious matter. A formal review will begin next week." The line went dead. Maya stared at the screen, a slow realization settling in her chest. This wasn't a coincidence. This was retaliation. Meanwhile, across town, Lisa Hernandez unlocked the door to her office, balancing a cup of coffee in one hand and her bag in the other. She stepped inside and froze. The room was a mess. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers left open. But it wasn't until she saw the smashed computer monitor and the missing hard drives that the full weight of the situation hit her. Someone had been here, and they hadn't just been looking, they had taken something. Lisa backed up, heart pounding. She reached for her phone, dialing Daniel's number with shaking fingers. He picked up immediately. "Lisa? My office was broken into," she said, voice tight. "They took everything." Daniel was silent for a beat. Then, "Call the police." Lisa let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You think they're going to investigate this?" She was right. Daniel knew it. Whoever had done this had made sure there wouldn't be any follow-up. Later that evening, Daniel sat across from Roger Dalton in a dimly lit diner. "You were right," Daniel said. "This isn't just about Reynolds. There's an entire network protecting him." Dalton stirred his coffee absently. "They don't just protect him. They benefit from him." Daniel's expression darkened. "How?" Dalton hesitated before speaking. "Drugs, money laundering, extortion. There's a group inside the department that's been running operations for years. They use officers like Reynolds to do the dirty work, scare people, make evidence disappear, silence anyone who gets too close." Daniel clenched his jaw. "And you're just telling me this now?" Dalton met his gaze. "Because now, you're in it, and they know it." Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. Then Dalton added, "One of Reynolds' old victims, guy named Andre Gaines, filed a complaint against him 2 years ago. A month later, he vanished, never found a body, never saw a search warrant. Just gone. A cold weight settled in Daniel's chest. He drove home late that night, his mind a storm of thoughts. The city streets blurred past him, but he barely noticed. When he arrived at his house, something felt off. He stepped onto the porch and saw it immediately, his front door. Slightly ajar. His pulse spiked. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The house was quiet, too quiet. In the kitchen, a single sheet of paper lay on the table. Daniel picked it up, his fingers tightening as he read the words typed neatly in the center. "You want to keep going? Then you'll be next." Daniel stood there for a long moment, the paper crumpling slightly in his grip. They wanted to scare him, but all they had done was confirm one thing. He was getting too close to the truth. Daniel stood in his kitchen, the note still clenched in his hand. The words stared back at him, a silent warning meant to rattle him. His pulse had slowed, but the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. This wasn't just a scare tactic anymore. This was a declaration. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police. The dispatcher answered quickly, but Daniel kept his voice steady. "There's been a break-in at my home," he said, and a direct threat left behind. Less than 15 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of his house. But when Daniel stepped onto the porch, his stomach twisted. Captain Samuel Briggs climbed out of the car. Briggs adjusted his belt as he approached, looking around casually, as if this were nothing more than a routine call. His eyes landed on Daniel, and he smirked. "You called in a threat?" Briggs asked. Daniel didn't bother hiding his frustration. "Someone broke into my house and left this." He held up the note. Briggs took it, glanced at the words, then shrugged. "Could be a prank. You are a public figure, Carter. People love to stir things up." Daniel's patience was wearing thin. "A prank? My mother was targeted. My legal team is being threatened. And now my home is broken into. And you're telling me this is nothing?" Briggs sighed, shaking his head. "I get that you're feeling paranoid. But unless you have actual evidence that someone meant harm, there's not much we can do." Daniel exhaled sharply. "So you're not even going to file a report?" Briggs flashed a tight smile. "I'll make a note of it." With that, he turned, walked back to his cruiser, and drove off without another word. Daniel watched the taillights disappear. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He had just gotten confirmation of what he already knew. There was no one in that department he could trust. The next morning, Daniel made a call. "Carter," a woman's voice answered. "Been a while." "Karen," he said, pacing his office. "I need your help." Special Agent Karen Mitchell had been his contact at the FBI during a corruption case years ago. She was sharp, relentless, and, most importantly, someone he trusted. Daniel laid everything out: the threats, the break-ins, the fabricated evidence against his mother. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. "This is serious, Carter," she said, "but you know I can't open a federal investigation without clear evidence. Right now, all we have are threats and speculation." Daniel knew she was right. "Then tell me what I need." Mitchell hesitated. "Find a financial trail. If Reynolds and his people are part of something bigger, money will lead us to it. And if you can get a direct statement from a whistleblower inside the department, I can push this higher." Daniel nodded, already thinking through his next steps. "I'll find it." That night, he sat with his mother in her living room. Evelyn watched him carefully as she stirred her tea, the soft clink of the spoon against the cup the only sound between them. "I don't like this, Daniel," she said finally. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know, Mama, you're going after people who don't play fair," she said, her voice low, "and they're making sure you know it." Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "I can handle this." Evelyn looked at him, her gaze steady. "I just need to know that you'll make it through this. That you won't let this fight take everything from you." He wanted to promise her that. But deep down, he wasn't sure what the cost of this battle would be. A few hours later, Daniel pulled into his driveway, the weight of the day pressing down on him. As he cut the engine, his phone rang. He frowned, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. He answered, but before he could speak, a voice came through, low, deliberate. "You really think you can walk away from this, Carter?" Daniel sat up straighter, his grip tightening on the phone. The voice continued, calm but dripping with warning. If you keep going, you're going to lose more than your career. Think carefully before you make your next move. Then the line went dead. Daniel lowered the phone slowly, his gaze shifting toward the street. A car sat parked a few houses down. Its headlights were off, but as he watched, he saw the faint glow of a cigarette ember inside. Then, as if sensing his attention, the car's engine rumbled to life. The headlights flared on, illuminating the darkness for a split second before the vehicle pulled away. Disappearing into the night, Daniel remained seated, heart pounding, as the silence settled back around him. They weren't just watching, they were waiting for him to make a mistake. Daniel stood at the podium, the bright camera lights blinding him momentarily. The room was packed: journalists, legal analysts, activists, and even members of the public who had caught wind of what was happening. The air was thick with anticipation, the quiet murmurs of the crowd settling into tense silence as he adjusted the microphone. He wasn't here to play defense. He was here to go on the offensive. My office has received multiple credible complaints regarding misconduct within the police department. He began, his voice firm but controlled. These allegations are serious, and they will be investigated thoroughly. There was a shift in the room, a murmur running through the press. This wasn't just a vague acknowledgement of corruption. This was a declaration of war. To his left, Maya Roberts stood with her arms crossed, her presence a silent show of resilience. Despite the bogus charges against her, she refused to back down. To his right, Lisa Hernandez, still shaken from the break-in at her office, prepared to step forward. She had lost crucial evidence, but not her voice. Lisa took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. My office was broken into. Hard drives containing my investigation into Officer Mark Reynolds were stolen. That's not a coincidence. A wave of hushed voices rippled through the crowd. Maya stepped forward next. I am currently under investigation by the State Bar for allegations that are entirely baseless, she said, her voice steady. We have reason to believe that this is an attempt to silence those pursuing justice. Daniel looked out at the press. This is bigger than any one case. This is about a system that has operated in the shadows for too long. That ends now. Hours later, Daniel sat in his office, reading through reports when his assistant knocked and entered, her face pale. You need to see this, she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a legal summons. The police department had filed a formal complaint, accusing him of abuse of power, interfering with an ongoing investigation, pressuring witnesses, and using his position for personal gain. Daniel exhaled sharply. It was a predictable move, but no less frustrating. Then the television in his office flickered to life with a breaking news segment. Captain Samuel Briggs stood before a podium, addressing reporters. We believe Attorney General Carter is manipulating the system for his own political agenda, Briggs stated, his expression grave. This is not about justice. This is about power. And then, as if on cue, Reynolds appeared on the screen. He played the victim well. I've dedicated my career to protecting this community, Reynolds said, but now, I'm being targeted for doing my job. He shook his head, sighing as if deeply wounded. This is a political witch hunt, and I won't stand for it. Daniel turned off the TV. His jaw clenched. They were shifting the narrative, turning him into the villain. His phone buzzed. A text message. No name, no number, just a link. Daniel hesitated, then clicked. A video loaded. The shaky footage showed his mother, Evelyn, walking slowly down her front steps, carrying a bag of groceries. The quality was grainy, but there was no mistaking what this was, a surveillance video. And beneath it, a single line of text. You can risk your career, but are you willing to risk her life? Daniel's blood ran cold. They had just made it personal. Daniel paced across his living room, phone pressed tightly against his ear. The image of the surveillance footage still burned in his mind, his mother, alone, unaware she was being watched. He had expected threats, but this was different. This was a direct warning. On the other end of the line, a security firm representative spoke in a calm, professional tone. We can have a team set up within the next few hours. Full surveillance, armed personnel, motion-triggered cameras, whatever you need. Daniel didn't hesitate. Do it. By nightfall, a private security team was stationed outside Evelyn's house. New cameras covered every angle of the property. The locks were reinforced, but none of it eased the knot in Daniel's stomach. Evelyn, sitting in her kitchen, sipped her tea as she watched the new security detail outside. She glanced up when Daniel walked in, the concern evident in his face. "I don't like this," he admitted. She set her cup down and folded her hands together. "Neither do I, but not for the same reason you do." Daniel frowned. "Mama, they're escalating. This isn't just about me anymore." Evelyn met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I know what's happening, Daniel, but if you stop now, they win. You've come too far to back down." Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He had always admired his mother's strength. But this was different. They weren't just fighting a corrupt system anymore. They were up against something darker. Something that didn't care about laws or rules. The next morning, Daniel sat across from Special Agent Karen Mitchell in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe. She had a manila folder in front of her, fingers tapping idly against it as she spoke. "The FBI is officially opening a preliminary investigation into Reynolds and his associates," she said. "We've reviewed the video tampering evidence, and combined with witness intimidation allegations, we have enough to move forward." Daniel nodded, but he could hear the hesitation in her voice. "What's the catch?" Mitchell sighed. "This isn't just about one dirty cop. If what we're seeing is true, this could expose an entire network inside the department." She leaned forward slightly. "And they know we're coming." Daniel didn't flinch. "I don't care. We have to do this." Mitchell studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then brace yourself, because they're not going to let us get that far without a fight." That night, Evelyn sat in her living room, a blanket draped over her legs as the television murmured softly in the background. The news flickered between political updates and crime reports, but her mind was elsewhere. Then, suddenly, the screen went black. The lights overhead flickered once, then shut off entirely. The hum of the refrigerator cut out. The soft whir of the security cameras ceased. The house fell into silence. Evelyn's grip on the blanket tightened. This wasn't a simple outage. She reached for her phone. But before she could dial, something outside caught her eye. A shadow moved past the window. Slow, deliberate. Someone was there. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. But before she could dial, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A loud thud echoed from the back of the house. She froze. Someone was inside. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she moved toward the nearest light switch. But the power was still out. The darkness pressed in around her. She had lived in this house for decades, had walked these halls 1,000 times. But now, it felt foreign, like a trap. A slow, deliberate creak came from the kitchen. Evelyn's breath caught. Then, a figure emerged. A man dressed in black, face obscured by a ski mask. He moved with purpose, a glint of metal flashing in his hand. A knife. Evelyn took a step back, her body stiff with fear. The man raised the weapon slightly, as if testing her reaction. Then, a gunshot split the air. The sharp crack of the bullet sent the intruder stumbling backward. He didn't fall, but the sudden burst of sound was enough. He hesitated for just a second, then bolted. Evelyn barely registered the movement of the security guard as he rushed in from the hallway. Gun still raised. "Stay back, ma'am." The back door slammed open, the intruder disappearing into the night. Seconds later, another guard burst in from the front yard. Breathless, "We lost him," he said, frustration thick in his voice. He was fast, knew the exits. Evelyn's hands clenched the fabric of her sweater. She forced herself to take a breath, but it felt like she couldn't fill her lungs. Then she saw it. On the floor, near the back door, something gleamed under the faint emergency light. A knife. He had dropped it in his escape. This hadn't been a warning. This had been an execution attempt. Less than an hour later, Daniel pulled his mother into a tight embrace, his mind racing as he took in the aftermath. The guards had secured the perimeter, but that didn't mean they were safe. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," he muttered, voice tight with anger. "They're trying to kill you." Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, her touch steady despite the fear that still clung to the air. "Then we make sure they don't win." Daniel swallowed hard, then nodded. He had already made his decision. His mother wasn't staying here another night. By morning, She was gone. Relocated to a secure location. With guards he trusted watching over her every second. That afternoon, his phone rang. Karen Mitchell. We're moving forward, she said. The Bureau is launching a formal investigation. Relief flickered through Daniel, but it was short-lived. Mitchell's voice turned sharp. There's something else. Reynolds is gone. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean, gone? He's off the grid. No sign of him at his house. His phone's off. No credit card activity. It's like he vanished overnight. Daniel's stomach twisted. If Reynolds had fled, that would be one thing. But that wasn't what this felt like. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an encrypted message from an anonymous source inside the police department. 4 words. He's not running. He's planning. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of those words settling over him like a storm cloud. Reynolds wasn't gone. He was just waiting for his next move. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the encrypted message on his laptop screen. His contact inside the police department had just sent him an audio file, one that could either save him or destroy him. He clicked play. At first, the recording was filled with background noise, muffled voices, the hum of an air vent, the faint rustling of papers. Then a familiar voice cut through. Briggs, they want to play dirty? Fine, we'll play dirtier. Another voice responded, low and measured. And Carter? Briggs scoffed. He's already lost. We'll leak the right information. Make it look like he fabricated evidence. Interfered with an ongoing investigation. Once the public turns on him, the feds will have no choice but to back off. There was a pause, then a chuckle. By the time we're done, no one will trust a word he says. The recording ended. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. They weren't just trying to cover their tracks anymore. They were coming for him directly. If they succeeded, he wouldn't just lose his position, he could be facing prison time. He had expected retaliation, but this was an all-out war. Later that evening, Daniel met with Lisa Hernandez in a quiet office above a small downtown news station. Lisa leaned forward, her expression unreadable. You're telling me they're trying to frame you? I'm telling you they already started, Daniel said, sliding a flash drive across the table. This recording proves it. They're orchestrating a smear campaign to discredit me and bury the investigation. Lisa picked up the drive, weighing it in her palm. And you want to go public with this? Daniel nodded. Live broadcast. No edits. No spin. If we release this as an exclusive report, they'll try to control the narrative. But if we do it live, they can't stop it. Lisa sat back, considering. This is risky. If you do this, there's no turning back. Daniel met her gaze. I'm already past that point. Lisa tapped her fingers against the table, then sighed. All right, tomorrow morning, we go live. The night before the broadcast, Daniel barely slept. He sat at his desk, reviewing every detail of the case, every document, every witness statement. Then his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. A familiar voice came through the line, low and mocking. I hope you're ready to lose everything. Carter. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Reynolds. There was a slight pause before Reynolds continued. You think you've won, don't you? Think you can expose all of this and walk away clean? Daniel stayed silent, letting him talk. Reynolds chuckled. You have no idea what's coming. The line went dead. Daniel set the phone down, his mind racing. Reynolds was back, and he wasn't alone. Daniel stood at the podium, the bright lights of the press conference burning into him. The room was packed. Journalists, news anchors, independent investigators, all watching, waiting, camera lenses focused, recording every movement, every breath. He took a steadying breath and began. For weeks, my team and I have been gathering evidence of corruption, cover-ups, and abuse of power within the police department, he said, his voice calm but firm. Today, I'm making that evidence public. A large screen behind him flickered to life. The first video played, the doctored footage of his mother's traffic violation. Then, a second clip appeared, this time enhanced and analyzed. The timestamp manipulation was highlighted in red, exposing the fraud. Murmurs spread across the room. Daniel didn't stop. This next recording, he continued, proves that certain members of law enforcement were not only aware of this corruption, but actively working to protect it. The speakers crackled. Then the audio played. Briggs' voice filled the room. His words unmistakable. They want to play dirty? Fine. We'll play dirtier. Daniel let the weight of those words sink in. Then, he pressed forward. This is not about politics. This is not about revenge. This is about justice. Beside him, Lisa Hernandez nodded at her assistant. In real time, her news agency uploaded every document, every piece of evidence onto the internet. Within minutes, the story was no longer just in that room. It was everywhere. At the back of the hall, Captain Samuel Briggs pushed through the reporters, his face tight with barely controlled anger. This is an outright attack on law enforcement, he barked. Carter is using his office to settle personal grudges. None of this proves misconduct. Just a desperate man twisting facts. Before Daniel could respond, another voice cut through. That's not true. The room turned toward a group of uniformed officers standing near the side entrance. One of them stepped forward, Sergeant Andrew Lawson, a respected veteran of the force. He looked directly at Briggs. We've seen what's been happening inside the department, Lawson said. Some of us have tried to speak up before, but we were threatened, silenced. Not anymore. Other officers behind him nodded, some stepping closer in solidarity. Then, another presence moved toward the front of the room. Karen Mitchell. The FBI agent's expression was unreadable as she took the microphone. As of this morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has officially launched a corruption probe into the Minneapolis Police Department. She announced, multiple officers and officials are under scrutiny. Arrests will follow. Briggs' face turned pale. The tension in the room was reaching its peak. Then, a sharp crack. A gunshot. The sound cut through the hall like lightning. Daniel barely had time to register it before a security guard lunged forward. Slamming into him, they hit the floor hard. Chaos erupted. Screams. People scrambling for cover. Cameras still rolling. Daniel blinked, his breath coming fast, his ears ringing. The security guard who had pushed him down groaned, gripping his shoulder. He'd taken the bullet meant for Daniel. Daniel turned his head. In the chaos, near the entrance, a figure was slipping away. Mark Reynolds. The gunshot had turned the press conference into chaos. Reporters screamed, cameras swung wildly, and security scrambled to form a protective wall around Daniel. Pain burned through his shoulder, sharp and hot, but he barely registered it. A security guard had taken most of the impact, but the bullet had grazed Daniel's skin before embedding itself in the stage backdrop. Karen Mitchell was already barking orders. Lock down the exits. We need eyes on every security feed. Outside, sirens wailed as officers rushed to secure the area. A chase unfolded in the nearby streets, agents pursuing a figure dressed in black. The suspect moved fast, ducking through alleyways, slipping between parked cars. Then, just as quickly as it had started, he was gone. Inside, Daniel pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder, watching as Karen returned from speaking with the perimeter team. Lost him, she muttered, frustrated. Daniel exhaled sharply. Do we have a face? Karen gestured to one of her agents, who handed Daniel a tablet. The paused security footage showed the blurred image of a man exiting a stairwell moments after the gunshot. Daniel's chest tightened. Mark Reynolds. An hour later, an emergency meeting took place in a secured FBI safe house. Mitchell and her team worked tirelessly, issuing a national warrant for Reynolds' arrest. But Daniel's phone vibrated with a message before the official alert even went out. Roger Dalton. He's still here. Daniel stared at the text. Dalton had been watching from the inside, following the trail Reynolds left behind. He's not trying to run. Carter. He's waiting. The full weight of those words settled over Daniel as he pulled into his mother's neighborhood later that night. The security detail was still in place, but something was wrong. The porch light was on. The front door was open. Daniel's stomach dropped. He rushed inside. The living room was empty. The house was too quiet. Then, he saw it. A phone sat on the coffee table, the screen still illuminated from an active call. He stepped closer. The video feed flickered, and his blood ran cold. Evelyn was tied to a chair in a dimly lit room, her face calm but her eyes filled with quiet defiance. Then, another voice came through the speaker. A voice Daniel knew too well. Let's finish this. Carter. Reynolds said. Come alone. You know where to find me. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel was tight as he drove through the darkened streets. Following the vague directions Reynolds had implied in his message, he hadn't called the FBI. If they stormed in, Reynolds might panic, and if he panicked, Evelyn would be the one to suffer. The road stretched ahead, empty and desolate, leading to the outskirts of the city. After several turns, he spotted an old warehouse, its rusted exterior illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. He stepped out of the car, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He wasn't armed, he had nothing but his words. But words had never stopped a man like Mark Reynolds before. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with dust and the faint stench of oil. Daniel's footsteps echoed as he moved deeper into the space. Then he saw them. Reynolds stood near the center, gripping Evelyn by the shoulder. His gun pressed firmly against her temple. Her expression was calm, defiant, even. But Daniel could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers subtly trembled. Reynolds smirked. You actually came alone, he mused, his voice laced with mockery. I almost thought you'd bring your FBI friends. But I guess even you know how this game is played. Daniel took a slow step forward, hands raised. This is over, Reynolds. The evidence is out. You're out of options. Reynolds let out a humorless chuckle. Options? Carter, I never had options. You think I woke up one day and decided to be the villain? I just played the game the way it was meant to be played. His grip on Evelyn tightened. And you? Trying to change the rules. You don't get to win. Daniel's gaze flickered toward his mother. He needed to buy time. You still have a choice, he said carefully. Let her go. Turn yourself in. You don't have to go out like this. Reynolds' smile faded. His eyes darkened. You think I'm afraid of prison? There's only one way this ends. He adjusted his grip on the gun. Then, a gunshot rang out. Reynolds stumbled. His grip on Evelyn slackened, the weapon slipping from his fingers as he collapsed onto his knees. His breath came in sharp gasps, his hands clutching at his side. Daniel spun, expecting to see a SWAT team, or maybe even Mitchell, but instead, he saw Evelyn. She stood tall, gripping the gun that had once belonged to Reynolds. Her hands didn't shake, her eyes didn't waver. For the first time, she wasn't a victim. She was a mother protecting her son. The FBI burst through the warehouse doors moments later. Agents swarmed the space, securing the scene, checking Reynolds' pulse. He was alive, but barely. Mitchell approached Daniel, her expression unreadable. It's over, she said. Daniel exhaled, nodding, but deep down, he wasn't sure that was true. In the weeks that followed, the dominoes continued to fall. Briggs was arrested, along with several high-ranking officials involved in the corruption ring. Investigations stretched beyond Minneapolis, uncovering deeper networks of abuse and cover-ups. Justice, it seemed, was finally catching up. Then came the press conference. Daniel stood before the cameras once more, bruised, exhausted, but resolute. A reporter in the crowd raised a hand. Do you believe justice has been served, Mr. Carter? Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then, he said, justice isn't a moment, it's a fight that never ends. That night, as he and Evelyn returned home, the television played another news segment. A different city, a different case, another black man assaulted by the police. Evelyn watched the screen, then turned to her son. Her voice quiet. We won this battle, she said, but are you ready to fight the whole war? Daniel looked out the window, where a group of protesters had gathered, their voices rising into the night. He had his answer. Yes, justice is never a single moment, it's a battle that never ends. Daniel fought not just for his mother, but for every victim of a system designed to silence them. Yet even as one corrupt officer falls, another case appears on the news, another fight waiting to begin. So we ask you, how do we keep this battle for justice alive? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind power and corruption, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths. The fight isn't over yet.